Hello, my name is Todd McLaughlin. Welcome to Native Yoga Center. Can spondylolisthesis be cured through yoga? The answer is no, it cannot. But let me tell you what it can do for you, because I don't want to be the bearer of bad news, but the reality is with spondylolisthesis, which this is not a great example because this is a spine that is aligned properly. But in spondylolisthesis, and I'm just going to focus on the lumbar spine, like say the L5, this vertebra down here, will slide forward, and this causes pressure on the disc pad, the disc space, and also onto the innervating nerves. And it can also cause stenosis, which is a narrowing of the canal that the spinal cord travels through. And so when there's a misalignment of the bones, I think it's almost like too optimistic to say that yes, yoga can cure this. I highly recommend see a medical professional, have an MRI or X-ray. MRI would be ideal, and have an understanding of what you are working with. If you've received the diagnosis of a spondylolisthesis, then you've probably seen the images and you've seen how the vertebra has slipped forward. Now, a surgical repair can fuse and pull the bones back into place. And so I personally have spondylolisthesis. I'm opting to not have a lumbar fusion surgery. I am a yoga practitioner and teacher, and I've been teaching yoga for the past 30 years, involved in practicing yoga for 30 years, I should say, sorry, and I've been teaching for the last 24. And so with that being said, I love yoga, and I'm not gonna stop practicing yoga. However, I realize now that I've had my diagnosis, I aware of what I'm dealing with, that I don't expect that all of a sudden by doing a pose that it's going to pull the bones back into place. However, what I do feel yoga can do for spondylolisthesis and or back pain in general is that it can teach us how to become aware of our bodies, to be aware of how we position our bodies through the asana, through the yoga posture practice. And we can start to learn how to alleviate pressure and avoid where we are applying increased pressure that is causing pain. It requires finesse. It requires a lot of practice. It requires impeccable patience. And if anything, we can use our challenge for future growth, for transformation, and for evolution. So now I want to point out a few things that will help you to get started. If you're new on this journey, either you've never practiced yoga before and you've become aware that you have spondylolisthesis, or this will be applicable to a large majority of back pain suffering. Or you already have a current practice and you found out that you have spondylolisthesis, and that explains why you've been in so much pain. The two main things that you're going to come across when you start research is that it's advisable to not backward bend. And to try to explain why that is, and it might seem obvious, but if it isn't, I want to help it to become obvious that when the vertebra slips forward, then going backward will put excessive pressure onto innervating nerves and the spinal column. So generally speaking, backward bending is only going to exacerbate the grade of slip that the disc has done. And so no back bends. And the other thing to be aware of, and I'm going to show you what that means though, because there is a way to still back bend and does not put pressure on the segment where the spondylolisthesis is. Okay, and the other big one to just be really cautious of in the beginning as you test it out is twisting. There's a lot of twisting poses in yoga. So I'm just going to break down a few of the poses that we use that involve backward bending and twisting, and give you some ideas, tips, and tricks for strategy on how to alleviate some of the pressure. Remember, always seek the advice of a medical professional. I highly recommend it. My own seeking of advice gave me a lot of insight And that's why I'm here now with you. All right. So with that being said, let's investigate some backward bending. And a really simple one that you're going to start to begin to notice if you've begun practice is backward bending when we're standing. So right now, when I go here, I can feel pressure in the area that I feel pain from my spondylolisthesis. And so whenever I'm instructing and or taking practice or practicing where it involves a back bend while I'm standing, what I'm focusing on, and I encourage you to try to focus on, is take your abdominal muscles and squeeze them so that your pelvis does a slight posterior tilt and the lower portion of your ribs will descend down. So it's going to be a combination of a posterior tilt and a drawing of the lower ribs inward and downward. And what that does is it opens up the space here on the back. So we're not in a back bend, we're actually in a very slight gentle flexion position, which is forward. And then I'm just going to take my arms and reach up, maybe drop my head back a little bit, and really just focus on stabilization of the core and not bending backward. Maybe I can access a little bit of backward bend in my upper back, but really I'm going to focus on keeping this lower portion strong. Now, I know a lot of us, I always hear all the time, people come in and say, I can't do yoga because I'm not flexible. And the answer usually is, well, that's why you're here for yoga. And then we think, well, yoga is all about flexibility. It's not. Actually, what's interesting is we have to switch our way of thinking to, I'm not trying to get more flexible in my lumbar spine. I actually want to stiffen it, which is so counterintuitive to everything we've been taught or thought about yoga practice. So once you start to integrate this idea that stiffening actually is a very valid goal to work toward, it is as admirable as flexibility. So that's something to keep in mind. Okay, another back bend, camel pose. Camel pose can be a deep back bend where we would go back and grab a hold of our heels. But again, the same rule applies that we were doing when we were standing. Taking the tailbone and doing so. Right now, this is called an anterior tilt, which increases the extension of the spine, which is pressuring it more. And then this is a posterior tilt. This is where we take the tailbone, we tuck it through. So you create a posterior tilt to the pelvis and an engagement of the front of the body, which seems counterintuitive because in a camel pose, you're going to actually be stretching all these muscles. But for those of us that are learning how to move with spondylolisthesis, it's important. We're going to keep our hands on our hips, and we're only going to bend a little bit in the upper body. But everything from, say, about so like middle spine, about T7 or 8, that's kind of right about middle. From about T7, 8 down through sacrum, we're not really going to put pressure into that. Now, that's a little easy for me to say because I'm working with my body all day long, every day, and it just gets easy once you start to be constantly moving and analyzing all these little segments of the body. But when you're new, we have no idea. We don't know. We just follow what the teacher says and we go backwards. So what I'm going to suggest is don't go backward in the beginning and just focus on tightening up the front, contracting and engaging the front, and working with maybe a little bit of bend. As I can get a little bit of range with the bend of my knees, I can still work on strengthening my quads by coming back here. But I'm going to keep this section stiff, and I'm going to let the upper section bend a little bit. And now I feel no pressure, very little pressure. Only really when I'm coming up right about here is where I tend to feel pressure. So I'm just going to do a little counter stretch to round. And a lot of times I find like counter stretching any attempt to go in that direction with a nice strong cat pose, where in cat pose, I'm engaging my abdominal musculature and rounding. Now, there's so much to talk about. I'm going to keep this brief. Another classic position is Cobra. In Cobra, we're going to treat it in much a similar fashion. I have my legs together. And remember, you can do Cobra with legs apart. There's no real steadfast rule here. But I'm going to go with the legs together one for now, just like a little gap. And when I lift up, notice just my chin and chest is lifting, but I'm still going to pull my belly, and I'm going to try to do that same exact pelvic tilt thing. Whereas instead of trying to bend backward into the lower back, I'm actually going to try to lift, similar to cat pose, this lower portion where the belly button is, below the navel. It's a slight flexion position, actually. So what's really interesting is you start to learn how to navigate doing flexion in the lower and extension in the upper at the same time. It's not going to look as cool as all the pictures you see online, but who cares about cool when you're in pain, honestly? So, and if you're here because of pain, you know what I'm talking about. All right. So you're going to try to push the pelvis down into the floor by contracting gluteus maximus, a little squeeze in the hamstrings, but also tighten your quadriceps so your legs and your glutes are nice and strong. And then while keeping that pressure, it's just a very gentle upper body lift. And if I get to here and I feel a little bit of pain, a little bit of pinch or a little bit of pain, I'm going to lower down a little bit and just focus on squeezing the belly, squeezing the belly. Another thing I want to point out, it's really important that you need to work with a teacher that understands what you're going through. If you have a teacher that doesn't understand anatomy and they just say, no, you push, you go backward, you got to tell them or stop practicing with them, honestly. All right, so now twisting poses. So let me start off with a really easy seated twist. It's in Sukhasana, and we'll come across this one like in even gentle yoga classes. And so what I'm going to do for the twist is, again, I'm going to try to pull the belly in. Let me turn sideways so you can see. I'm going to do a little tilt of the pelvis back. Think cat pose. Think I want to try to sustain a lower spine cat pose in almost everything I do. And when I go to twist, I hold this cat pose position. So I'm not going to push into a back bend. I'm going to keep a gentle flexion and then just work very stable in the upper back, pulling the belly in. The movement's going to come more. There's very limited twisting rotation motion that happens in the thoracic. A big portion of it happens in the cervical spine, specifically the top two vertebrae. But I'm not going to crank on my twist and try to go as deep as I can around or even kind of go backward into it, especially not back bending and twisting. Doesn't feel good. So belly in, little pelvic tilt like the cat, and then a squeeze of the abs. We're working with the internal and external obliques, and we twist. I feel no pain right now. Let me see if I can find pain. And you're probably like thinking, don't do it. Don't worry. Right about here, I start to feel some. It doesn't feel good. So I'm like, all right, well, there's the answer right there. I feel pretty good here. This is where I'm going to hang out today. I'm going to focus on my breath. I'm going to focus on the engagement of my core. I'm going to focus on positive thinking, like I'm doing the best I can right now. I'm going to do the best I can here now today. I'm going to use this challenge as a growth opportunity. This is a key mindset for dealing with back pain. All right. I just wanted to give you the basics today, give you some ideas. I've been getting a lot of interest around this subject, and I can speak to it because I experienced it personally myself. If you have any questions, don't hesitate. I love answering questions. I appreciate the community. Thank you so much. Find me on my website, nativeyogacenter.com. Check out my podcast, Native Yoga Toddcasts. Subscribe to us on YouTube at Native Yoga. Check out our free course special on the link. You see it there. It's a free online course called 8 and 8. Learn 8 limbs in 8 days. It's free. Try it out. I think that's about it. Have a wonderful day and namaste.